Welcome to the Faith Forum, a series of talks with leading thinkers, best-selling authors, business leaders, philosophers, artists, and theologians of our time. We're so happy you've joined us, and we hope this podcast offers food for your spiritual journey. From Christ Episcopal Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, I'm the Reverend Chip Edens, and this is the Faith Forum.
Well, this year we are reflecting on the power of hope. And I think if we are honest with ourselves, we're all looking for hope in life. It could be that it's something that we're trying to find in our own lives as we're sort of coming out of COVID and as our lives have been turned upside down. And some of us are kind of wondering, how do we want to live our lives now in light of all that we've experienced and what we're sensing is true about ourselves? And what does it mean to bring that into life? No doubt others here have brought with them today a concern for a member of their family or a friend who is going through a very difficult time. And, there's nothing like the experience of powerlessness when someone that you love and care for so much is enduring something that you can't exactly help them with, that they sort of have to own it themselves, and that sort of journey to wholeness and is something that we can pray for and that we can come together around to support. Some of us are looking for hope in our society, in our city, with such deep polarization and difference, with the kind of warism that exists in our public and political rhetoric, a fear of a divided nation rather than a unified nation that we need in order to help create a society where everyone can be fully alive. So where is hope to be found? And how do we bring hope into reality? So we're really reflecting on that year, and what we're appreciating about hope is that it isn't just a light switch. It is a process. It's a process, but it's a process that if we can sort of be faithful to, will lead us into possibilities that we're not imagining right now. This is the amazing thing about grace, is that you don't know what it's going to look like, right? But it comes. And so I believe today we have one of the most important conversations that we could really have, which is about the spiritual life and the role that spirituality plays in our lives. We have today not only a person who is so deeply spiritual and soulful, and who has her own story to tell about her journey, but who is also a scientist. And those of us who are in the room today who are oriented around numbers and facts and outcomes, where spirituality is just a little squishy, well, I'm glad you're here, because you're going to hear some, irrefutable facts about what Dr. Miller has learned. Lisa Miller is the New York Times bestselling author of The Spiritual Child. This is her second time with us. She's a professor in clinical psychology in the Teachers College at Columbia University. She's the founder and director of the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute, the first Ivy League graduate program in spirituality and psychology. And for over a decade, she's held joint appointments in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia Medical School. She's also done incredibly innovative research, of which this book speaks, that's been published in 100 different peer-reviewed articles. And the kind of things that you and I read every day: cerebral cortex, the Journal of Psychiatry, the Journal of the Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. She lives now in Florida, and with her husband, who's here today, and they have 3 beautiful children. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Miller.
Thank you.
So this is how it's going to work. Dr. Miller is going to give about a 20-minute presentation on her work and what she's discovered. Then we will have a conversation, and then she has bravely offered to answer your questions. And the only thing that I'll ask when we get to that point is that your questions be questions. Okay. Welcome.
I am so grateful to be here, to be back with you. And Chip, you are such an inspired, loving leader. The way he loves you, he truly loves you. So I am grateful to come to you as a clinical scientist, as a parent of 3. My children are all in the zone of 18 through 22, so they are emerging adults. And I'm going to share with you this science as an invitation. Effectively, science certainly does not prove spiritual life. It needs no proof. Our own inner wisdom is hard data, and yet at the same time, as you know, we are knowers in many ways, right? At the table of human knowledge is the logician, the empiricist, the intuitive, the mystic, and when we can engage all forms of human knowing together, we have realized our wholeness and possibility to live in alignment with what I would say God's world or the world, whatever words are your own. So I'm sharing with you this science as perhaps a form of witness. I take science, let me put it this way. I have found on the road that many people say I am very scientific. I don't know about this spirituality stuff. And other people say, I am a profoundly spiritual person. I don't care what science says or doesn't say. Science can't do much. It's been my journey in life to see that spirituality and science go comfortably hand in hand. Science is a lens, and whether we're using a telescope or a microscope or an MRI study or genotyping, we can take that lens and point it at a broad host of questions. The limitation in the 20th century to examining spirituality in the human life was not a shortcoming of the method of science. It's actually a rather straightforward, rigorous method. But we didn't hear much in the 20th century because scientists themselves, as a community, what might be called scientism, the vogues, the culture, the latent secular hardcore materialism in science, prevented scientists from turning the lens and saying, what really is the impact of lived spirituality in the human life? And what can we discover? So it's in that frame that I share with you what we now have is 2 decades of good science, peer review science. As you know, for an article to be published, it needs to be seen by 2 or 3 scientists blind to the author 2 or 3 times, so that science monitors itself and puts forward what we know to the best of our ability to be fact. So what do we know? Well, the first thing that I think will probably make sense to a great number of people in this room, but is actually lost in center field culture, is that spirituality and religion go hand in hand for many people, perhaps many of you in this room. About 70% of people in our country say, I am a deeply spiritual person, and my transcendent experience is held in the prayers of my faith tradition. It's held in my community, our sacred text. 30% of millennials, and fewer with each older generation, say I am spiritual, but I am not religious. For me, I experience spirituality in art, in nature, in music with my family. Whether or not we are religious, every single one of us lands in the yellow circle. What 20 years of science has shown us is that every one of us is born a physical being, an emotional and cognitive being, and we so too are all born innately spiritual beings. We know this through the lens of twin studies. We look at twins raised together, twins raised apart, and factor out the degree of commonality as a function of shared genes and shared environment. Temperament, for those of you who've held a newborn baby, is half innate, half environmentally formed. If you have seen more than one baby, you'll see some are born very laid back, some are rather agitated, some are born with externalizing or an internalizing temperament. But if we soothe the baby in how we raise our children, of course, modifies temperament. The capacity through which we experience spiritual life is 1/3 innate, 2/3 environmentally formed. Spiritual life is our birthright. And yet, in the first 2 decades of life, our parents, our grandparents, our community, our faith community, our school all weigh in to mold and shape and form this innate capacity for spiritual life. Now, to be a bit more precise, scientists do not define spirituality. For thousands of years, people have chased that. What scientists are good at is identifying those threads of lived spiritual life which bear enormous impact on the rest of our lives, which are in fact tidal wave changing. And the 2 that science has found to be extraordinarily transformative of our lives are a direct relationship with God, whatever your word may be, a transcendent relationship. I turn to God for guidance in times of difficulty. When I have a tough decision to make, I ask, what really does God want me to do? These are not beliefs, these are perceptions and a lived dynamic relationship. Some people might say their higher power, or they might say Jesus or Hashem, or whatever their word is, but we are born with this innate seat of capacity to perceive spiritual life, and it is here. We ran this study together, the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute, with our colleagues at Yale Medical School. We invited people into the scanner, live action, movie camera, to watch blood flow. And we said, tell us about a time when things were tough and you were stressed. And then tell us about a time where you felt a deep personal relationship to your higher power, God, the universe, whatever words are yours. Nobody was confused. They all knew what we meant. Some said, wow, I'm so glad you asked because I've carried these stories with me and no one has ever asked me before. This is our birthright. What you're looking at is the seat of transcendent awareness. It is what I call the awakened brain. And it's characterized by 3 major dimensions. The first is that just as we were loved and held as children in our parents' arms, the bonding network is engaged when we are in prayer, when we feel God's presence, and we know, we see that we are loved and held. Whether we say Jesus walks with me, or God holds me, or life itself buoys us up. The second dimension is that we shift the way we see the world through our attention network. We move from a top-down dorsal, I've got to get this, I have got to get that promotion, I have got to get into UNC, I have got to get her to say yes, yes, got it, red door, right? But the red door's stuck. In fact, we just saw in the past 18 months, it was very stuck. And when we can no longer rely on the dorsal attention network, strategy, tactics, going after what I want, and there is no red door to open, it's not working, we can drop the dorsal and move to the ventral attention network, and suddenly there's a broad field of life, a host of opportunities, and many people say the right opportunity, the yellow door pops. I could have spent my whole life charging by the yellow door and never seen it, hitting my head, kicking the red door. But when I move to an inspired and awakened form of attention, life has far more possibilities, and the one that's right for me. I meet someone new. I get a new line of work. I move to a neighborhood and meet some best friends. Something I didn't know was possible was before me. Never could have known it was there looking over my shoulder with only today's knowledge and historical knowledge. And finally, we are loved and held. We are guided, bottom-up attention. The third dimension is the use of the parietal that puts in and out hard boundaries so that you have your magnificent journey and you have yours. We are unique. We are magnificently diverse, man, woman, different races, different orientations, and still we have one deep, common, shared human experience. There's one human heart, which means that even in times of terrible loneliness and seclusion, we are actually never alone. Loved, held, guided, and never alone is the seat of transcendent awareness, our spiritual awareness, what I call the awakened brain. We're born with this. Remember, 1/3 innate. And when you look at a child, it is clear that their awakened brain engages all of life. Because loved, held, guided, and never alone is both the neuroseat of perception when we talk to God, and it is the same neuroseat of perception when we see God in one another. Love of neighbor, altruism. And it is the same seat of neuroperception when we see God's presence in nature, in the sunrise, in our love of fellow living beings. This child sees it already. We're all born innately spiritually aware. We are all born spiritual children. I go into the references if you want to see the detailed studies and go on Medline or PsycInfo, you can pull them up. They're all referenced in the awakened brain. But what I want to emphasize here and now is that this is not just a happier way of living. This is not merely something that would sort of add icing to the cake. It turns out when we look through the lens of science that the spiritual core is foundational. It is what is essential to all other lines of moral development, our health, our ability to connect and love. In the spiritual child, which I was grateful to share with you here about 4 years ago, I share in the science that a young adult, a teenager, through peer-reviewed science who says, yes, I turn to God for guidance in times of difficulty. When I have a tough decision to make, I pray, I meditate, I walk in nature and hear what God really wants me to do, is moving from the world of chasing the red door, where we are makers of our path, to a world of opening yellow doors, where we are discoverers of our journey. So that when difficulty comes, there is immediately available a spiritual response to loss, an awakened reaction to disappointment, even to pain. And because of that, a teen who says, yes, my personal spirituality is highly important to me, is a standard deviation above as compared to below the mean. 80% less likely to become addicted. If you told me that my 18 through 22-year-old children were 4/5 less likely to become addicted, which, put painfully the other way around, were 4 times more likely to become addicted without the spiritual core, then I would, and here, take this pill right here. And you can buy it at Walgreens. Any one of us would sleep on the pavement for that pill. If you told me that my 18 through 22-year-olds were 60% less likely to have a major depression, every teen gets depressed. But when there's a spiritual response to stop the downward spiral, when it's mainly about disappointment, when it's about frustration, when it's a natural reaction to grief, before it becomes major depression. Major depression is powering down. It's a loss of connection with life. It's edginess, it's anger, it's not just sorrow. And as something we face right now in the country together, I work with the Pentagon, I work with private sector, I work with higher ed. There is one American challenge right now. One, and it is the epidemiological crisis of the diseases of despair. And the diseases of despair indeed are depression and addiction, and also suicide. A young adult, a high school student, is more likely to die by suicide than by auto accident. This is our American challenge, and that's now pressing down to middle school. In a study of studies, a meta-analysis, Wu and colleagues found in over 2,000 tragically completed suicides and 5,000 matched controls, matched for demographic and diagnosis, there was a 62% decreased relative risk of suicide when we have a strong personal spirituality. And that goes up to 82% when our personal spiritual life is shared, as you're doing right here. And so now I bring in the second factor, which is just as it is absolutely tidal wave changing onto our lives to have a strong, transcendent relationship, to be in relationship with God and see God's presence in and through life. The second dimension is that we show up for one another in that shared transcendent awareness. That awakened awareness, spiritual connection might be shared. Shared in collective prayer, shared in collective service, love of neighbor, altruism. So that just as we perceive and know that we are loved, held, guided, and never alone, so too we show up for one another so that as a community, all are loved and held. We are there to offer guidance and no one is ever alone. It was very beautiful when I showed up today. Before I could walk in the front door, 4 people greeted me with love, 4 members of the community, sitting here now. Who you are is relational spirituality. And again, you're using that very same seat of transcendent awareness. It's the same neurodocking station, love of neighbor, showing up for one another, as is used when we feel God's presence directly. This is a national crisis, but shockingly enough, the rub is actually in resourced communities. My dear colleague, Dr. Sunya Luther, spent years looking at impoverished communities, and only as a control group, she brought in one day, about 15, 20 years ago, a well-resourced community. And to her shock, Dr. Luther found higher rates of the diseases of despair, addiction, depression, anxiety, suicidality in highly resourced communities. Higher rates than in the inner city. And when she looked under the hood, what she found was the feeling in children that we need to sing for our supper, perform, 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 get through the red door. And that even if I got through that red door, there'd be a little bit more flicker in my parents' eyes, whether or not it was true, the perception of contingent love. Right? Now, these were children from loving parents, so I don't really think that any of us parents love our kids more when they're successful, but the perception in the culture that I am as good as my parts and pieces, I am as good as my recent accomplishments. So much was that the case that she went and she looked at well-resourced high schools. And what would you imagine were the top 2 predictors of being accepted, social esteem amongst boys? The number 1 was conquest of girls, and the number 2 was drug use. Right? And these are beautiful souls. These are our sons, right? The social ecology of well-resourced communities. Transactional relationships. Right? Left willy-nilly, transactional relationships. And in girls, number 1 was weight. The skinny girl felt more love and connection, was liked more. And number 2 was mean girls, instantiating rank by being cruel to others. Right? Again, beautiful souls. This is a social ecology driven by transaction, driven by red door pursuits, what I call achieving awareness. But when I joined up with Dr. Luther, we said, okay, the national rate, you just saw it, at which a young person raises their hand and says, I turn to God for guidance. Relationships are spiritual events, not transactional, but loving, transformational relationships. We walk side by side. The national rate, 70%. In highly resourced communities, any guesses? Less than a quarter of the national rate, 15%. How do I get my child into that 15%? It turned out, without exception, the children in highly resourced communities made their way into that narrow 15% if their family was part of a spiritual community. Most often a faith community, sometimes a community of contribution. But there was somewhere else to go where day in and day out we know each other as souls on earth, children of God. More than whether today you are on the front page of the paper for making $10 million or on the front page of the paper for stealing $10 million. You're loved equally because you've come here to grow, and we love you. We love you beyond what you do or don't do. We love you beyond what you have or don't have. Relational spirituality. And in fact, in the making of this brain, this is a brain with a direct connection to God, right? But how did that brain get there? About 70% of the time in adults, they're part of an active spiritual community. Okay, so Chip, how am I doing on time? I'm okay? I think you're just a gracious host.
You're doing great.
Okay.
This is the gospel.
Okay, if a little more science. Okay. This I share with you because I think it may look like minimalist art, like an Ellsworth Kelly or something, but this is actually the greatest testament to the human condition. This is a sample of 3,000 plus people. They happen to be vets, and every single person in this study actively has PTSD. Everyone is traumatized. And as you go out the x-axis, what you see is increasing levels of trauma. More and more anxiety, more and more sleeplessness, more and more spontaneous anxiety and plagued by the event. As you go up the y-axis, we see units of growth. So the very first thing we see, all told, is that struggle and growth go hand in hand. Struggle is a catalyst for a deepening of spiritual life. I work with the Pentagon, and the chief of chaplains says, through trauma, we grow bigger inside. Trauma is an opportunity for awakening, that much more. And ever more so when we show up for one another and help on this journey. Now, as you see, with more trauma is more growth until we get to a point where the struggle is so heavy that we're flooded and we need support to grow. This was a study by Tsai and colleagues. Tedeschi and colleagues said, well, what are the 4 predictors of getting up high on that curve? And they are that we can access our painful memory, that it can be put in words and shared together. And most importantly, that we then can shine the light. I would say my word is God, but shine the light of spiritual awareness onto that painful, hidden, dark memory. Because with moments of despair and often moral injury, actually more foundationally comes spiritual injury. And spiritual injury is when I was aware of a time in my life where I felt closer to God. Spiritual injury is when I feel perhaps unworthy, and that's a very dark place to be, unworthy before God. But when we address spiritual injury, we see a type of not just recovery or resilience back to baseline, we see renewal, being bigger inside. And that is our opportunity now. As individuals, we have felt enormous isolation. Many of us have felt down and stuck and even traumatized, so much so that we've gotten perhaps in a rut in our brain. That's just a very small part of our brain and of our being. And now is the time to move from kicking the red door to awakening to who we really are for one another and who we are as souls on earth. And in this sacred world in which we are not makers of our paths, but in a deep relationship. What is God showing me now? What is the dynamic relationship opening up? Where are the yellow doors? We're at a new beginning. We're at a precious new beginning in our own lives and who we are together as a society. We are in a ditch, and the only way out is a spiritual way out of the ditch. I have seen student after student at Columbia University who comes to our Awakened Awareness group, having been through very good therapies, but still carrying spiritual injury. Healing necessitates the spiritual core. And in fact, in my work with Health and Human Services, we're doing national-wide partnerships between vital faith-based communities like yours and mental health clinics, because the only way out of the ditch is a spiritual way. Trauma is spiritual injury very much of the time. Okay, now if you set this up in your young child, it's there the rest of their life. It is stable, it is enduring. And what does this mean? Instead of so much of Western culture is, what do I want? What do I want? Achieving awareness, set it with my head, and then the heart can go after it with appetites and yearnings. But what if we reverse the order and ask the heart, what is true north? Where does the compass point? receive inspiration. At the table of human knowing, listen to the mystic and the intuitive, the transcendent knowing. And knowing of the heart then informs the head as the strategist how to implement and go after the deeper purpose and direction of the heart. And it looks like this. When we do it, we build strong pathways between forms of knowing. All the members at the table of human knowing are connected. We literally myelinate tracks between regions of the brain so that we are more innovative, more intuitive, more able to love and connect, and more able, yes, even to have outward success. Achieving awareness alone in the end doesn't actually yield on its own more outward success. It needs to go hand in hand, head and heart, with our awakened capacity for transcendent awareness. Quest. What is life showing me now, and what does my heart say about that? What in this deep dynamic relationship is God showing me now, and what does my inspiration point me to do? This is our birthright. It's the same all around the world. Remember the Venn diagram? Whether I'm Christian, Catholic, Jewish, Hindu, we are all made this way. And this is our pathway back together again. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
So there are a number of things that I'd like to think with you about. But I think before we do, I just want to acknowledge how incredibly important this day is, that you've named the deep reality of our God-given spirituality that often lays fallow because of a lack of awareness or a lack of opportunity to cultivate that. And I think we can all appreciate today that we have been injured in our lives, that perhaps we're living with that injury now, and that the process of hope is a journey of integrating your life and other helpers, whether they be therapists, priests, friends, integrating those dimensions with the spirit and personal spirituality and awakening that, so that we can discover the yellow door of whatever that is, that possibility that is set before us in future, that we need to walk toward together, because the red door has been closed or it's not available. But there is this other door that leads to possibility. I want to talk to you in a moment about some dreams that I've been thinking about here, of a program, even a center one day, where there can be core classes and experiences that awaken the spirit in people, where we can have people come in and lead us into those connections between spirituality and parenting or marriage or aging or the middle passage of life, midlife, or singleness, or whatever it is, that deep integration. I'm sort of dreaming about journey groups that we can take together, because we need to. This is a walk. Epiphanies come often in groups, and where we can sort of bring together the therapy that we have here. Many of you know that we have a full-time therapist on staff. We've just hired a second one through the blessed gift of a very generous family, and that therapy is free. And then to combine that with spiritual direction for people who want to explore that path and how to take the path forward. And that we might not only be a community of healing and transformation as we emerge out of COVID, but that we can also raise up exemplars. So I'd like to play a video of something that has really moved and touched me, and I'd love to get your reaction to it. Could we play this video, this story, this hope story?
My name is Molly Rudisil, and this is my hope story. In July of 2020, my dear friend Lucy Wiley passed away in a tragic car accident. She always searched for the best possible thing and everything, and made everything so much fun. Not only that, it was a week after the loss of Sally Saz, and she was also just this amazing girl. And I had never experienced death before this. It was the first time I ever had to deal with mourning. I made a promise to Lucy when she passed away that I would continue to spread her light and her joy to everybody that I touched, because you only heard good things about Lucy when she passed away. And I would want to be remembered that way. But because I am here now, I've decided that I'm going to spread her kindness, because I am now living for Lucy and living for Sally. One of the ways which I have decided to spread this love and kindness to everybody is through the creation of the Perfectly Imperfect Project, which is a social media platform which my friend and I created in efforts to help break the teenage mental health stigma, which was very prominent, especially at the time of Lucy's death. My friend and I, we decided that we would, instead of letting this disappointment and just mental health issues weigh us down, we decided to share our stories about how we have dealt with our mental health and how we have dealt with this just hopelessness. We also spread positivity, spread inspirational messages that spread hope to others, that by sharing each other's stories, by sharing positivity, people realize that they're not alone in the battle. They need this. People need this. People need to be reminded that there is still good, that there's always going to be hope, that things are going to get better. It's been probably one of the most impactful things that I have done in a while, because the responses that I have given, or that I have gotten from people, is it's life-changing when I realize that I'm giving other people hope.
From pain to possibility. What do you see in that?
She's showing up for sisters and brothers, and so that no one will be alone. She's showing up so that others will be loved and guided.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
I know. So what is spirituality? I mean, that's kind of a squishy word. Can we go back to that basic concept? What is spirituality?
Well, as a scientist, I can share with you the dimensions of lived spirituality that are built into us, a relationship with our higher power, and to see God's presence in one another. That is built into us. What I find remarkable is, while we look around the world, we've looked in India, we've looked in China, we've looked in the US, and fellow teams have looked in Thailand and Ukraine and Uganda. Because we are inherently spiritual beings, in our path through life, there are spiritual chapters like clockwork that come upon us. So with puberty into adolescence and emerging adulthood, if you look through a longitudinal twin study, there's a 50% increase in the heritable contribution, which means whether we expected it or not, a biological clock goes off, and we hunger at 15, at 18. What is my meaning? What is my purpose? Actually, what is the meaning written into life? What is the purpose? Existential, deep hunger and striving.
And I'm struck, if I may interrupt, in that beautiful video, it's amazing to think of this precious child, loved by her parents, loved by this church, who has been awakened to spirituality in the midst of brokenness, and is is figuring out what's that thing that she can do, and that she's doing that. How old is she? 17 years old. I mean, so there's this awakening in the teenage years, yes, big time. What happens to people, spirituality at midlife? I mean, midlife is such a crazy time, right?
A reawakening.
A reawakening.
And in the beautifully designed family, often the surge, the spiritual hunger in the adolescent is concomitant with that of the parent's midlife quest. I mean, in our culture, we've nicknamed it midlife crisis, right? And it's treated as a, really with no more seriousness than sophomore slump. But actually, both are profound times of spiritual emergence and to be honored as life-changing, transformative moments.
Who am I? What is my purpose? If we're married at midlife, who are you? What's your purpose? That cacophony of meaning and struggle and trying to understand. Say something about spirituality and aging, generally. As we get older, 60s, 70s, 80s, what do you see that can be lived out? I hear that this can be one of the most extraordinary spiritual times.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the clarity of what is true and purposeful, not just what do I want my life to have been, but what is life most foundationally. From midlife onward, I think Jung talked about this. The first half of life we are building. It can tend to be very outward. In the second half of life, we turn inward and explore what really is most significant in God's world. That is hardwired, too. Somewhere around my late 40s, I started not seeing the menu at restaurants very clearly. And right when I was softening on my outward eyesight, my inward eyesight was getting a bit stronger. I think it's all one story. Yeah. And I've even noticed that at midlife crisis, not only is this a time where we start to ask, how have I used my life? Have I served God? Have I done honor to this gift of being alive? What type of parent have I been? What type of spouse? Oftentimes, from a spiritual perspective, the inside and the outside are all one story. And my worst fear just happened, right? If it's that I was attached to my money, I lost my money. If I was worried that my kid would succeed, my kid didn't, whatever it was, right? And that is the opportunity of a lifetime to go deeper.
And a part of that, I think, of spirituality and grace is forgiveness and forgiving ourselves for maybe what we thought we should have, would have, could have done, sort of letting that go. And the healing power of forgiveness. Could you speak about, you tell a story in the book about a Yom Kippur service. Tell people what Yom Kippur is first. And what I think is really interesting is that you didn't go into this work with the thought of focusing on spirituality. You were thinking about health and the resilient life, and you stumbled into spirituality. Tell us about that moment when that sort of came alive and the power of forgiveness and spirituality.
That's right, Chip. So when I was a doctoral student, my mentor for 4 or 5 years was Marty Seligman while he was starting the positive psychology movement. And I love Marty very, very deeply. And we agree on so many things, foremost that how we choose to engage our inner life has enormous consequence on our lives. But we've never agreed on this point, which is the importance of spirituality as we're describing it as a deep, transcendent perception of something real, right? Of God's true presence. So I went into the field of risk and resilience. I was a clinical psychologist on an inpatient unit in New York, and we served really the Upper West Side and Upper Manhattan. Around the time that I was there, it was the Jewish high holidays. And I'm Jewish. I'm not a rabbi. I'd never led a holiday service. But it occurred to me that there was no service on the inpatient unit. So I simply asked the unit head, could I do this? And he said, well, we've never had anyone ask that before, but I don't see why not. And I offered because this patient who was very, very, very ill, very, very depressed, had asked very quietly in community meeting if there might be a service. And the answer was no. And the no was very upsetting and harmful and incendiary to a gentleman who was really struggling with an explosive bipolar. And he said, no, no, no. And instead of addressing that spiritual hunger, he'd been escorted out. So I show up, I am carrying my grandmother's prayer book that she had brought. Actually, I'll share with you that she has since passed. We were very, very close, and it was my grandmother's deep spirituality that was transmitted to my mother, that was transmitted to me. Yeah. So it felt good to have her prayer book. And there we were. What I noticed was as I looked around the table, no one else was on the unit that day, and people who normally face down, wouldn't make eye contact, scantily clad in sort of humiliating robes, treated as if they had some form of, appendicitis because they were struggling in the heart, suddenly were sitting up at the table. They had come with a sense of joy and reverence for a sacred holiday. And by their sides were their aides, who also treated the moment. Most of the aides were from a different faith tradition. They treated the moment with reverence. And as we moved through the Yom Kippur text, which is, of course, about forgiveness, that we first apologize to one another, and once that is squared away, ask God for forgiveness. We have to fix it twice. Go around the table, and the woman, we start praying, and the fellow who'd been so explosive and constantly pulled out and locked up and given injections actually started to sway with the prayers ever since his boyhood that he had known. And he was far more conversant in Hebrew than me, and he was holding us, in a sense, in the cadence of the prayers. He was anything but explosive. He was transcendently moving. And the woman, who was so depressed she apologized for even existing, piped up and said, I've always known that on Yom Kippur you could ask for forgiveness. But today here I realize that we can be forgiven. What I saw quite specifically was a reemergence of health that was equal and opposite in a very specific way to their greatest point of struggle. And it occurred to me that what we call mental illness can include some biological factors and has a great deal of spiritual significance, because they were in the prison house. The ego had eclipsed the bright light, the sun of their spirit. And when the spirit was reignited, when the sun was so strong that it could overpower the limitations of the ego, they retasted their true being and health.
So imagine if we could take whatever we're holding right now in our lives about ourselves. Let's start with ourselves, all the things we think we did that were not correct or our shortcomings. Imagine if we could forgive ourselves, or if we could forgive others around us in these sort of penned up, charged, or distant relationships. Imagine that. Think about the transformation of health that could happen in our lives, in our families, and in our communities. I mean, that would be a massive transformation. Massive transformation. What I want to ask you to do, Dr. Miller, is to take us through a little spiritual exercise. Would you be willing to do that?
I'd be honored.
And then I'm going to ask you a question, then we're going to do some Q&A. So let's do that. Let's explore, maybe, as we think about our lives today, what would look like to sort of show up to the spiritual work that God's inviting us to.
Okay. Thank you. Before I share any practice, I like to honor the teacher who shared this first with me. So this was taught to me by Dr. Gary Weaver, who passed about 10 years ago. This is a visualization, as always, an invitation in the language of life. And I'll share this with you as a gift of love and as an opportunity to engage your own awakened awareness, your own natural seat of transcendent relationship. Okay. I'm going to invite you to take 5 breaths and clear out your inner space. I invite you to set before you a table. This is your table. And to your table, you may invite anyone, living or deceased, who truly has your best interest in mind. Anyone living or deceased who truly has your best interest in mind. And with them all sitting there, ask them if they love you. And now you may invite your higher self, the part of you that's much more than what you've done or not done, anything you have or don't have, your true eternal higher self, and ask you if you love you. And now finally, you may invite your higher power, God, whatever word is yours, however you know your higher power, and ask them if they love you. And now with all of those people sitting there right now, what do you need to know? What do they need to share? What do they need to tell you now? When you're ready, I invite you back. This is your counsel, and they are always there for you. Who shows up may change in our path in life, and you can ask them. I turn to God for guidance in times of difficulty. You can ask them what is on your heart. This is your birthright to call counsel. They are always there, and can we awaken to see them?
So you've just had an experience of awakened awareness. And when I went through that exercise just beforehand, it was a range of things that I felt. Like, who do I want to have at my table? Right? And are they going to be nice all the time? Right? Do I love myself? And what about God? What can I expect from God? Will that be all love all the time? And what would happen if God totally showed up? Would I have to somehow do some work myself? No. And yet I also felt that there was so much grace. There was a summoning to awakened awareness to the work of spirituality in everyday life. We're going to turn to a few questions, but what do you think about this idea of a program or center that offers this continuum of care, spirituality, groundedness, practice, therapy? There's a continuum there of practitioners, of experiences, not just teaching, but experiences, of journey groups, of people that go deeper. What do you think about that idea?
It's magnificent. It's magnificent. And in our darkest hour, it must be a spiritually integrated psychotherapy, because trauma is not only about the relational shock and betrayal or disappointment. Trauma is about a spiritual hurt. Mm-hmm. And still, there, particularly with young adults, it is the norm in our culture to wait until they're in the therapist's office to build the spiritual core, to build any core. But can we get ahead of this? And in convening young adults in our culture and climate, in the relational, this beautiful.
And this is a big thing that you said. What percentage, if we go to therapy, what percentage of therapists have an integrated spiritual model for therapy?
Less than 2%.
So imagine again the continuum. Prayer, spirituality, conversation, the integration of spirituality into every aspect of your life, and then also therapy, support, journey groups, healing groups. It's a big opportunity. Let's turn to a few questions. We've got just a couple of minutes left. Who would like to
Love
ask
questions.
a question?
Or resonances or thoughts. Or...
Okay. Yes.
Thank you for being here. Rural North Carolina has high church attendance, but also has a huge problem with opiate use and with drug use. Have there been studies about communities like those with high church attendance, high church involvement, but yet the illnesses of despair like opiate use?
Thank you. So I shared briefly that I've been working for a few years with the Department of Health and Human Services, which has in it the Office of Faith-Based Opportunities. And now it's called the Faith-Based and Community Opportunities. And our national work has been to build partnerships in exactly the type of crisis that you're describing, areas where there is a strong spiritual connection, and bring the presence of spiritual awareness into the treatment process. Bring in a specific way the presence of spirituality into the U-shaped curve, so that the trauma itself is understood from a spiritual perspective through which there's a rearrangement of meaning and a sense of being good and worthy. So that depression is understood not just as an unwanted feeling, but as an accurate feeling to a need for spiritual breakthrough and growth. Depression is a doorway to spiritual growth. So in these partnerships, I call it a layer cake. Right? We work nationally now. We're working nationally through the Spirituality Mind Body Institute and Health and Human Services to find unmet need and where that unmet need might best be fulfilled through those who understand the community, the clergy, and mental health targeting the problems. So yes, enormous need.
And Jim, I would say that are those churches taking an integrated model that we're trying to embrace here? I think the work we're doing here at Christ Church is it's the very beginning of very pioneering work. So my question is, with those churches, are they bringing an integrated model to how they do their work? And then I would also ask, what would those communities be without those churches? Let me put my mask on real quick. Excuse me. A question here and then a question back here. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
It's so hopeful to hear about the work you're doing with the Department of Health and Human Services. And I'm curious, what do you see as the barriers and possibilities for getting this valuable information into the secularized society, into schools, into programs like the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention? How, there's a void in sharing how spirituality impacts health. So how do we get it there?
Thank you. And one of the initiatives I'm working on is this, getting it into K-12 education in a way that's inclusive and constitutional, the yellow S circle. If it's a faith-based school, then of course through that faith tradition. If it's a non-faith-based school or a public school, the yellow part of the S, right? And because this is our birthright, and it is essential to build the spiritual core in the first 2 decades of life for health and wellness the rest of life. It's essential. And in this initiative, we actually talk about the fraying of civil society because of lack of spiritual atrophy, right? So 40 years ago, in the good attempt to be inclusive, we threw religion out of the public square, and with it went the spiritual baby with the bathwater. 40 years is enough for a young girl to grow up, have a baby who's now 20. And for the first time, we have young adults, Gen Z, who have never prayed by their mother or father or grandparent's side or meditated or thought that morality was written into life as opposed to cherry-picked, right? That there was an absolute source, a relationship to a higher power that dictates morality. Right? So we have a mess. It is our American problem. And I see this, I was called into the Army for that problem. And it's in private sector. Private large companies say we can't train our 18 through 25-year-olds because the fragility and the fear of failure is so great. If all I am is my parts and pieces, then when it doesn't go well, it's absolutely collapsing. And in my own campus of Columbia University, we had 9 suicides in 1 year. This is the fragility of youth is because there is not a spiritual core that is being built. Now, in your community, yes, you're building the spiritual core. But broadly put across our country, we need, where it was not the job of institutions 15, 20 years ago, to view whole person formation as inclusive of the spiritual core, where it was not the job to support spiritual development, to simply have a functional, healthy, relational young adult, our institutions have to change. And that's higher ed, and that's the Army, and that's all of our institutions to be spiritually supportive. From transactional, narrowly put relationships to loving, transformational relationships, where, as it's put so very beautifully by Bob Chapman, who's in The Awakened Brain, any employee could be your precious child. Or in the Army, the squad is a squad of sisters and brothers. So if we can build the spiritual core, we are upstream from what otherwise are the very painful, certainly suicide. What the Army is honest about, which is we're riddled with racism and extremism, we're riddled with sexism and sexual assault. It's not just the Army. It's at every institution. And it's because of a lack of deep, you are my sister, sitting at council, knowing who we really are.
One last question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Miller.
Hi.
Thank you for your time today. Just to piggyback off that last question about awakening that spiritual core, especially in youth, have you seen any differences in your studies on children who attend secular schools versus religious schools?
Thank you for that question. There has not been a broad systematic study making that comparison, but I can share with you my experience of 5 years with the spiritual child. I went to hundreds of schools. Some were religious schools, some were not religious schools. And the moment you step in the lobby, you know if you're in a spiritually supportive school. And almost every religious school I visited was very spiritually alive, where the students would say things like, God is in, how do I put this? She said, I love all people, but my relationships, my close friendships, they have God in them. Or they would learn, for instance, as you walk around to a school, everyone is very excited to show you STEM, right? And you see the computer room and you see the 3D printer. But at a spiritually supportive school, the printer is being used by students making prostheses for the burn victims down the way at the hospital, so that learning is in service to one another, love of neighbor. We came up with, having looked at many, many spiritually supportive schools, a way that a school or any institution, whether it's the Army or I'm working with a large financial company, any institution can be spiritually supportive. A school-wide or organizational-wide practice of transcendence. It's not just mindfulness. Mindfulness gets us present, and we can then cross the threshold to spiritual awareness. So there's organizational-wide practice of transcendence. There's a language, a lexicon of inner life and spiritual presence. There are values that allow us to grow. Values are a verb. So the prize is given out to the person who is growing in their altruism, growing in their humility. There's a host of things, but any organization can be more spiritually supportive. Yes, we can do it. And we don't need to invent it in the lab. It already exists. We're just harvesting it and sharing it.
Mm-hmm. So what I want to say in conclusion is I think that we have an opportunity as a church to be a resource to individuals, families, but also to people in organizations, whether they be in business, in education, in the not-for-profit world, wherever, to be a resource where we can have these kinds of conversations and figure out how we integrate these things so that people can live a more spiritual, awakened, and resilient life. And what I'm happy to tell you about is that Dr. Miller is was willing to consult us and help us think about how to put things into practice here. So there's a lot to think about, a lot to dream about. Thank you for awakening us this day.
It's a joy to be here.
It's really amazing. It's really
It's
amazing.
a joy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We invite you to subscribe, leave us a 5-star review, and connect with Christ Church Charlotte on social media. If you'd like to attend a Faith Forum live, visit christchurchcharlotte.org/Faith Forum to view dates and details of upcoming talks.